Hey everyone, my name is Summer and I'm a student at York and also the PSC Events and Campaigns Executive, and I will be introducing your lovely speakers for today. So our first speaker today is Josh Lamers, who is a second year law student and is a current social justice fellow at the Black Legal Action Center with his master's and bachelor's of social work from Ryerson University. In the capacity of social worker, activist, community organizer, and scholar, Josh focuses on the intersections of Blackness, disability and madness, child welfare survivorship abolition, and queer trans identity. Josh is one of the co-founders of the Black Liberation Collective Ryerson, a collective of Black students attached to a larger movement of Black liberation who work within post-secondary institutions, where the work is challenging anti-Black racism in its many forms and to create safer spaces for Black students, staff, and faculty. Alongside the other organizers within BLC Ryerson, Josh's activist work brought over several systemic and tangible changes for Black students on Ryerson's campus, such as 8 renewable scholarships for Black students, an anti-Black racism climate review, a Black student space, and funding for Black student initiatives. His organizing also addresses over-policing on campus, ending Ryerson University's attempted Toronto Police Services partnership. In November 2018, in response to the dubbed Doug Ford anti-activist gag order directive, aka the freedom of speech policy, Josh led students in effectively organizing, resulting in Ryerson University being the only campus to not only distance itself, to openly distance itself from the directive. As a child welfare survivor, much of Josh's scholarly work and systemic organizing focuses on abolishing the system currently in place. His research, titled From Topic and Evidence to Architect, the Development of Black Diasporic Interpretive Phenomenology, and the Resistive Strategies of Black Child Welfare Survivors, received the Graduate Writers Award. He is also a co-founder of the Collective of Child Welfare Survivors, a group that focuses on reimagining how to address families and child welfare. This included the December 2018 12-minute shutdown of Queen and Bay Street in Toronto in response to Doug Ford shutting down the Office of Ontario Child Advocate. The 12 minutes were to commemorate the 12 youth who died while placed in child welfare that year. Josh has worked at several organizations, such as the Office of the Ontario Child Advocate, Resource Movement, Crossover Youth, the Voyager Project, and Planned Parenthood. As Josh shifts into the field of law, his goal is to truly disrupt the understanding of what the law is and can do for Black life from a rigorous and sustained stance within the Black radical tradition, Black feminism, and decolonial paradigms.
Hello. Oh, there we go. All right. Can everyone? There's a lot of fans going on, so if it's too loud, let me know. I can turn it off. So that was. I realized the bio feels longer when someone else is reading it. So my name is Josh. My pronouns are he, him. And today, in conversation with everyone, and this larger discussion of Black and Palestinian solidarity and the Black Lives Matter movement. The take that I want to have with this is really thinking about how do we have better movements. And when I think of this question, I first think from the space of Patricia Hill Collins when she talks about knowledge claims in her book Black Feminist Thought, and she says that when people, including organizers, including activists, when we make certain knowledge claims, it's fair for us to ask certain questions about where those knowledge claims are coming from. What is our history? What is that individual's history? And what kind of questions need to be asked? Recently, I don't know if folks have seen, but Dion Brand wrote an article, and she talks about the calculus. She talks about reckoning. And so for me, when I think of Patricia Hill Collins and Dion Brand, and I put those two things, these two individuals in conversation with one another, I begin to think about questions of, is the movement actually moving? Are we actually moving forward? And I say this because, particularly when we think of movements being co-optable, when we think about movements being turned into resume building and brand building, we have to take many steps back. And I think outside of, the Black Lives Matter movement, but we here in Canada particularly, we've seen the way in which Black organizers inflected Pride Toronto to really rethink their politics. And so Pride, or the Pride marches is what they're supposed to be, but these Pride parades and what a lot of Pride has turned into is a perfect example of what I mean when, certain knowledge claims are being made around queer liberation, and we have to ask substantive questions around, well, who is liberated? And so Pride provided us a microcosm example of the fact that movements are easily co-optable for certain individuals to benefit. Within the space of Pride, we saw that with largely white LGBT folks, and that's not to say they all benefit in the same way, especially when we think of, transgender non-conforming folks, but still, when we think of a movement that has been co-opted in a certain kind of way, Pride is a good example. And in this moment of, I keep saying we're in this moment of possible recalibration for the conditions of Black life. And it's only possible and it's only that. And when I read Dion Brand's article about how there's a calculus to bring us back to normal, I really think about how if we are in a moment of possible recalibration, then there are individuals and groups who are actually going to pivot and detour us away from the possible. And that's a difficult thing to think about, because we have to ask questions about everyone. We have to say, well, what is the movement moving forward with you in it? Is the movement moving forward with the knowledge claims you're making? And so when we think, and as the I guess the introduction was saying, when we think about, Black and Palestinian and Indigenous and racialized people solidarity, when we think of solidarity, we think of things like knowledge sharing. Earlier it was said that we're in this moment of politicization, and again, we're only in a moment of possible politicization. We have to think of things like white supremacy and anti-Black racism and colonialism, and we know this, but we have to remember that these systems of domination and tyranny are ever expanding and shifting. They don't want to undo themselves, and so they find ways to take Black Lives Matter and put it on a shirt, and now they're selling it for $20. They find ways to. We saw, many of us saw multiple corporations saying Black Lives Mattered, and a lot of their employees had to be like, well, is this you? And then we see all of this kind of public reckoning, even myself in my own individual life, especially when I think about particularly the relationship that it was an interesting moment to kind of go through this Black uprising, these possible recalibrations during June, what we call Pride Month, and to see the reactions and the reactions and the claims that white LGBT particularly and non-Black LGBT particularly folks are making around what needs to happen, how the movement needs to move forward. And so for myself, I've even had to engage in certain kind of public reckonings with individuals around me or near me who actually weren't safe for Black people. And I preempt all of this when we think of building better movements, because as was said in the introduction, a lot of people are calling for justice from colonial systems. And Dion Brand, in a video called "Writing Against Tyranny and Towards Liberation," I believe is what it's called, she speaks about how she does not ask for justice from unjust systems, right? And instead she writes towards liberation. And it's that kind of difficult reckoning that we have to have, right? Where are our movements pooling our energies? Again, Pride Toronto is a good example of, we don't really and I use that as an example. We don't really see or know the shifts that really happened, because there was, we had an executive director shifting in and out. We had continued quasi-police relationships, and while Black folks, including one of the individuals as a panelist, Yusra, put their lives on the line to call Pride Toronto to task. But again, as a movement, as a collective movement, we have to look and ask ourselves, but was there substantive and sustained change? And that's a difficult reckoning question. And let me be clear, that is Pride Toronto is responsible for how change may or may not happen and how things get co-opted. But certain individuals who say that they're organizers, they're also responsible, right? And, you know, for example, again, I can say that I was in a space where we were imagining what we could do with and for Pride and for community. And that never happened because certain individuals have the power to essentially decide if something moves forward or not. And so when we're talking about Black and Palestinian solidarity, and when we're talking about Black and Indigenous solidarity, the first thing we have to really think about is reckoning. What has been tried before, and what do we need to do to move forward? And I find that often our conversations get locked in, you know, certain kinds of, you know, identity politics where people deploy identity politics saying, well, you can't critique us because you're X, Y, Z. And again, Patricia Hill Collins says, well, no, right? From a Black feminist epistemology, we are asking radical and reckoning questions in order to bring us forward. And so, you know, for example, we saw that for Pride Toronto, it was a Black queer woman who was the head of Pride Toronto, but that didn't shield her from radical and reckoning questions. But yet we saw, again, as an example, we saw her trying to deploy her identity in order to shield herself from these integral questions. And we need to begin to ask these questions, firstly from ourselves, right? We need to ask ourselves, what kind of concessions are we often making for our personal benefit and not for the collective benefit? And I want to be clear, I do believe that people should be living well, and I think that people should be fed. I think that people should be safe. But I think that if there are certain people who, you know, as we're seeing kind of online, we're also having, amongst Black community, having conversations around not turning organizers into celebrities and dismantling celebrity culture. And frankly, you know, we see Beyonce making the, you know, co-opting again, Black radical organizing for her benefit, for a capitalist benefit. And all of these things in terms of capitalism, co-optation, homo nationalism, right? Where we see that it's largely white, queer, and trans folks who get to lead the charge and who are always the go-to people. But all of this in terms of white supremacy and anti-Black racism is a grid that many people can find themselves on, including Black communities, including Palestinians, including Indigenous folks. And so in this moment, I find the conversations that I'm having with organizers and with community is we're thinking, how do we reckon? Because a reckoning needs to happen, and some folks are not being reckoned with. Some folks are not holding themselves accountable to community, right? And I find this conversation of Black and Indigenous and Palestinian solidarity integral because, you know, I go to University of Windsor, and it was at the University of Windsor, and it really reflects how ingrained capitalism and capitalist and colonial thinking is, and has hold over institutions like universities and colleges, because it was in 2014, I believe, that the University of Windsor Student Alliance had ratified a BDS motion. They said they were going to do it. And the uproar that this caused in terms of the university essentially dismantled this the students' union, and then got to decide what the policies of the students' union would be going forward. One of the things was, for example, they can't run in slates because it was the same people that put forward the BDS motion that was successful. Those people then went on to being the board, the execs, and then they were pushed out of power. And so when I moved to University of Windsor, and again, one of the things that I do is that when I'm in a space, I'm learning the history of that space, because that way I can't be tricked into doing something that's been tried before, and I can't be tricked into talking about an institution like they haven't caused violence and harms. And, you know, in speaking to Palestinian students on campus about the level of violence and harm directed at these students, but we also, and through having those kind of conversations, we also see the way that whiteness and white supremacy reacts to our organizing, right? So I find that often, and you know, I find that often when we're talking about Palestine's liberation, and when we're talking about colonialism, I find that often the first thing that's deployed at me is, well, you're anti-Semitic. And when we think of how whiteness and white supremacy function to silence and discipline us out of challenging, it's frankly the same kind of rhetoric of, well, if you say that Black lives matter, then you must be anti-white because all lives matter, right? These kind of same like cognitive and logical pivots and steps to bring us into arguing with the semantics of whiteness. And that's something when we build better movements, we of course expose whiteness so that way we can dismantle it. I don't spend my time, as Toni Morrison has even said, I don't spend my time reacting to whiteness, but I sure overthink it because I have to. Because just as we, again, I said in the introduction, just as we are trying to pivot us towards the possible, there are many people pivoting us away from possible. And so, yes, you have to outthink whiteness. And so when we're building better movements, we have to, I said in the introduction, draw these connections, drawing these connections to even things, again, like Black Lives Matter in Palestine is not outside of having conversations about what's happening with and inside of and outside of Pride in the LGBT community, QA community. It's not outside of having conversations about what's happening inside of universities, right? Because universities, it was Adil Abdullahi at an event who said universities are a microcosm of what's actually happening in the real in the world. The real world is happening on our campuses, but often it's not being taken seriously. And I always find it interesting the way that I hold myself on campuses. Often, outside of now this current Black Lives Matter moment, I'm always kind of being disciplined out of taking the world that happens on campuses seriously. And so we have to draw all these connections. But building better movements, as was said in the beginning, why I brought up Dion Brand and writing against tyranny is I don't know if the movement should be, again, as I said in the introduction, calling for colonial governments to undo their colonialism, because they're not going to do it. We see the meek white man Trudeau, who's just going to pause for 21 seconds, maybe cry and say he cares. We've gotten a lot of, and when we draw these connections, when we make these links, and when we have these kinds of reckonings, we're also looking beyond obviously our own spaces, and we're looking globally. Black organizers in the U.S. said, "Stop painting streets and give us systemic change. We don't want yellow Black Lives Matter on the road. We want no cops." Well, then we have to ask certain kinds of questions around, well, what's happening here in Canada? Because we haven't had systemic change. We haven't seen a movement at the community level try to create certain kinds of interventions to, as best possible, reduce harm towards Black communities. Instead, we see paint. We saw paint at Yonge and College, and now we see paint over in Kensington Market. I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I haven't seen any kind of policy change. And building better movements and outthinking whiteness means that you're outthinking the way that you can be co-opted. And, one of the things that I was actively thinking about before coming onto this call was the way that, the movement to free Palestine has not been co-opted. It's a difficult movement to co-opt because it is directly anti-capitalist. It is directly decolonial. It is not pandering. And that's not to say that over here, when we're organizing, that people intentionally create movements to be co-opted. But movements have to have a certain kind of intellectual and ethical rigor in order to outthink how these capitalist, colonial, white supremacist, anti-Black institutions, governments are going to try to co-opt us, right? And that's, for example, why I was so upset that everyone's saying defund, defund, defund. And I was saying, well, as a logical step, you were providing the same people who are going to co-opt you, you're providing them the space to co-opt you. Say abolish with your chest, or don't say it at all. But when you said defund, that's what happens. When you say defund, you're going to get 10%. When you say defund, you're going to get reform, because you didn't outthink whiteness, and instead you chose a little catchy phrase being like defund, disarm. But guess what? We got nothing, because we didn't stick with our ethics, because we didn't think about this rigorously from an ethical and intellectual stance. And when we build these connections between all of these movements, between all of these issues, then we as a movement reckon with ourselves and do different kinds of things. And so for me, that's what I wanted to provide folks to think about. I didn't want to really talk too much about my experiences organizing, because I don't know if in this moment, if you go and read Dion Brand's new article, I don't know if in this moment it's integral that I'm telling you my experience of organizing in this way. I don't know if it's integral for me to describe what it's like to be a Black queer person organizing. I think more so what's needed, especially in Canada, which in organizes, and I speak to organizers in the Black organizers in the US, and they say that in Canada we move very different in certain kinds of ways. Some quote unquote good, some not so great. And so I thought for my contribution in this space, I wanted for folks to think ethically. I wanted folks to understand that reckoning needs to happen. And if reckoning isn't going to happen, then there are going to be people who push those reckonings into public view. And when we do that work, for those of us who bring that reckoning into public view, it's important to support those of us that do that, because we are doing it to build better movements. We are doing it because we believe we deserve freedom, and we believe that movements are more than about 1 to 6 individuals whose faces are always up in the media and who get the book signing. Instead, we're doing this for our collective lives. So thank you, folks.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. And I just want to let everybody know for the questions, just hang on to them until the end, but you can send them in the Q&A box, but we'll just answer them at the end. Okay, so now our last speaker for today is Nonkululeko Ntambo, who is a poet and performer invested in Africa oral traditions and artistic techniques around poetry and conveying of messages. She had gone on to work in copywriting with Thugs of Comedy and other freelance activities. She is the former chairperson of the Palestine Solidarity Committee and the South African Student Congress Wits branch. With her experience within the activist space, she has gone on to start community-based initiatives focused mainly on education. She currently works under the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, focusing mainly on youth organization and movement building in the continent. Her main activities involve working in the office of the Secretariat of the African Youth Networks Movement, a movement of over 100 youth networks spread across the continent dedicated to collaboration towards a better continent. She also works under the Youth Program for Elections and Governance, a program for education and a deepening of democratic cultures across the continent.
Good evening, everyone. Well, good evening for everyone in the Southern Hemisphere. My name is Nonkululeko Ntambo from South Africa, and my contribution is going to be mainly around how South Africa finds itself entwined with the Israeli apartheid state and what activism should look like for and does look like for us, right? I think I'd start off with noting that it's rather interesting that the founding of the Israeli state and the establishment of apartheid in South Africa happened, share a birthday, essentially. So in 1948, the United Party in South Africa, which was led by General Jan Smuts, which took a more liberal leaning in its politics, lost to the National Party, which was led by what would be Prime Minister Malan, which was the National Party took on a more right-wing Afrikaner nationalist stance. And in taking that stance, in protecting the people that had voted for them, their constituency, essentially, they established what they called a policy of separateness, hence apartheid. Apartheid in Afrikaans meaning to be separated. And that separateness was supposed to be of separate development, of separate growth. It was eventually called a policy of good neighborliness, that high walls make good neighbors, essentially. And why I note that these two systems share a birthday is that the two systems essentially sustained one another, right? And they show us how global capitalism sometimes even undermines the ideologies of the people themselves who need them, right? So I bring you then to 1976. 1976 was a very important year in South Africa, because it was the beginning of the student uprisings in Soweto. And the student uprisings basically brought the world into focus, to focus in on South Africa and what the atrocities that were happening, because before then, it wasn't usually the case that you would see the pictures of children dying on the streets. As everyone would know, the critically acclaimed picture of Hector Peterson being carried by a student and his sister screaming on the side. It was never a thing that was seen of the world in South Africa as a rumor of sorts, right? But 1976 happens, and these pictures are all over the media, and everyone is now seeing South Africa for what it really is. And it's not just hearsay anymore. It's just not just native ramblings anymore. Everyone has to look at it and face it, right? But another interesting thing that happened in 1976 was that the then Prime Minister of South Africa, John Foster, John Foster was invited to Jerusalem. And what's interesting about John Foster being invited officially by the state of Israel to Jerusalem is that John Foster, during World War II, was arrested for taking the side of the Germans during World War II, and had been known after the fact as a Nazi sympathizer. As many of you might have known, South Africa was a British colony at the time. So it would follow that South Africa would be on the side of Britain and America and all those type of powers. But John Foster himself withdrew from that position and vehemently followed and supported the Nazi Party, even to the point of being arrested for it. But the same state of Israel then invites this very same man to Jerusalem, hailing him as one of the greatest presidents to have ever lived. And at the state dinner, the then Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, says the ideals shared by Israel and South Africa, the hopes for justice, peaceful coexistence. Both countries, he said, faced foreign-inspired instability and recklessness. The South African Journal would then characterize this interaction a few months later as saying Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. They are both situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark peoples. And why I point this out is not only to point out the fact that Israel was one of the last countries to boycott, divest, and sanction apartheid South Africa. But the difference between South Africa and Israel is that South Africa eventually admitted that the policies and the system that it had enacted against its own people were inhumane, were a crime against humanity, a fight that we've been having of late, were a crime against humanity. Israel, however, has not. They have never taken a moment to admit, to acknowledge, to say in any sense of the word that the commonality that their own prime minister has said to have had with apartheid South Africa is a commonality that ought to not have happened, right? And so going on from there, that 1976 meeting brings about an alliance which essentially shifts the world, right? Because what happened then was that apartheid South Africa and Israel joined forces and became a world superpower in terms of the arms deal. They became very valuable, very lucrative players in the arms trading around the world. The then Israeli Prime Minister Israeli diplomat to Pretoria says that his name was Alan Lyle, if I'm not mistaken, but he says that basically Israel started the arms industry in South Africa, where Israel would provide the know-how and South Africa would provide the means by which the arms deal, the arms trading would happen, right? And the reason why this is important is because in the year 1976, the tactics, the military response, the guns, everything that the apartheid government uses to respond to those students that are marching against the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, but against the apartheid system as a whole. The thing that they are met with in response is Israeli tanks, is Israeli guns, is Israeli tactics, right? That the Israeli government has been trading with the apartheid system and has been training the police to perform in, right? And this is not a moment that is isolated in history, as our MC has already pointed out. The reason why Palestinians could help the Ferguson protesters is because the same tactics, the same policing systems, the same guns, the same armor that is being used against Palestinians is the same one that the American police has been using against its own citizens in the States, right? And going further, not only in Ferguson, it's being used today as well, right? And what that shows us is that the apartheid system is not only sustained by ideologies, because the invite of John Foster in 1976, who was a Nazi sympathizer, mind you, the World War II had only ended in 45, which is only a few decades ago at that time. All the survivors of the Holocaust were still alive, were still trying to find their way home, were still trying to piece their lives together. To invite this man to Jerusalem at that time points us to a very significant fact, which is that even though systems are backed up by ideologies which are inherently fascist and inhumane and many, many other things, they are sustained by capitalist systems. So the people who are the players in these systems, the people who inject the power and the gears from which it moves, don't necessarily even have to be friends. They only have to have a common interest, which is the sustaining of a power over a people. In 1976, it was a quote unquote hostile brown people. Today, it is rioters and looters and so on and so forth, and terrorists, lest I forget. But all these names just change to essentially foster what is the same narrative, that there must continuously be a hierarchy where certain people are on the top and certain people are on the bottom. So in that, I would then say that as a South African, looking at the world from this side, understanding that my own father was met with those bullets as an 11-year-old in 1976, and I then myself must then go and meet those same bullets with your FMF strikes, with your mind strikes that are happening. All of these things point to the same thing, that we can't dismantle systems one at a time. I can't come to you and tell you, today on the agenda it's apartheid Israel. Tomorrow it's Black Lives Matter. The next day it's the Sahrawi. The next day it's the Congo. It's not going to happen like that, because the systems which hold these things together don't separate themselves like that. People who ideologically absolutely despise one another. Because I think we must also point out the fact that for even in South Africa, the National Party was extremely anti-Semitic. when it was running for power, extremely against the Jewish people, pro the elimination, even given the person that they chose to lead them, the elimination of the Jewish people. But these are the same people who collaborated and set up industries with the Israeli government, right? So it goes back to what my other fellow speakers were saying, that you have to dismantle the notion that a hierarchy has to stand for communities to be alive, right? In South Africa, for instance, the fight against apartheid Israel is very much linked to a fight for our land back, right? Because ultimately the same capital that funded the Israeli state and the Israeli industrial complex and the Israeli arms, arms production in 1976 is the same money that's funding it now, right? Currently, we had a situation where an Israeli company bought one of the biggest dairy companies in South Africa, right? Those people who sold the dairy companies sold land that didn't belong to them in the first place, land that was stolen from Black people, land that had yet to be returned. So there's the sale of stolen property for this thing to fund the protection of other stolen property, right? So for us, it's very important that South Africans fight for their land back in order for them to be actual players in the global conversation against imperialism as a whole, and not just the Israeli state, right? And I think that this is the question for everyone around the world, that who owns your land, who owns your resources, who owns, even to the point of the people? Because we all know very well that, for instance, in the United States, most of the a lot of the prisons are privately owned, and it is perfectly legal in the United States to require labor from imprisoned people, which is another conversation about whether slavery was abolished or not, given that slavery can happen under certain requirements, and those requirements always tend to fit the same people who were enslaved in the first place. But again, conversation for another day. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the bodies of Black people in the United States are privately owned, right? And are privately owned, and to the point where they're not even owned by the states, right? So the land of of indigenous people is privately owned. The bodies of Black people are privately owned. The the language, the histories of those people are privately owned. So what exactly do you have left? And I think that's why I'm very much inspired by Josh when he says that, say it with your whole chest, abolish this thing, right? And maybe we are shooting for the stars and landing on a cloud with that statement, but the point of the matter is, and you'll forgive me for my ultimate redness, but really we have nothing to lose but our chains at this point. What exactly is it that we, as the quote unquote dark people, we as the oppressed people, we as the colonized people own? Who are we protecting this land for, right? Who are we going to hand it down to? And then secondly, I'd love to go into the institutions that perpetuate apartheid, right? So my fellow speakers have spoken very well and very articulately about the university space and how that system very actively, very outwardly perpetuates apartheid. But I think that we need to get into the more covert institutions. And shucks, I might get into trouble for this. But we must go into the more covert institutions that protect not only hierarchical structures, but protect capitalism and protect oppression under a certain under certain means, under certain requirements, that yes, no, you can't oppress people unless they are of this sort, right? In our own country, we had a discussion that took place a few weeks ago with our Chief Justice, Mogoeng, and the Chief Rabbi, if I'm not mistaken, of Israel. And we had to have a very difficult discussion about the difference between the Israel of the Bible and the Israel that we are seeing today. Because the more covert, support of the Israeli state comes from the infiltration of your religious circles in convincing them that the Israel that they see in the Bible is the Israel that they see that is happening today. And thus the requirements that happen, our Chief Justice is quoted as saying as that if he curses Israel, then God will curse him, and if he blesses Israel, God will bless him. And we're very lucky in our country to live amongst a religious society that is very much invested in debunking the myth that these two Israels are the same thing, and that to not call out Israeli apartheid is somehow a holy thing, or to not to not invoke the wrath of God, right? And I say this as a Christian myself, and I say this from a country which has a very rich Christian tradition in terms of the liberation space, right? And the liberation movements themselves. Your Methodist Church were very were very crucial in founding our own liberation movements in South Africa. Your ANC, your African National Congress, your Pan-African Congress, so on and so forth, right? But the more covert ways in which Israel gains support is by playing this line, is by making this thing blurry. And I think that it's not, again, or not all of us can enter every activist space, because maybe we won't be allowed in, but I think of anyone on this call, I think that we must be very mindful and watchful of those covert spaces where we don't we think that this is a safe space, but then we find out that it's not. And it goes on then further to the BDS movement, which companies are investing in the Israeli regime, which companies are from the Israeli regime themselves, right? In South Africa, we had a pullout of a lot of major companies from your Coca-Colas to so on and so forth, to your Pepsis, and now so on and so forth. When we asked for a boycott, divestment, and sanction against us. So we have to hold those companies to the same standard. If Coca-Cola doesn't find it, if Coca-Cola thinks apartheid South Africa is wrong, then surely Coca-Cola must have the same energy for apartheid Israel, right? And with every other company that is involved in such things, most of their ad campaigns and so on and so forth will be very quick to call Mandela a hero and talk about the great story of South Africa. And if that thing is immoral, then surely what's happening in Israel is immoral too. And we're not just saying it. Mandela himself is the one who says that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. So in closing, without taking too much of your time, I would say that from a South African perspective, it becomes very real, because when those arms trades were when that arms linkage was formed, and the relationship between South Africa and Israel was formed, even to the point where there was rumored atomic bombs being built in South Africa. And I'll go to the importance of that later. That relationship, Alan Leon says, who was the Israeli ambassador to Pretoria, says that that relationship could very well be what sustained the Israeli state to this day, because it was running out, you know. So the apartheid that we had to live through, that we are still reeling from, is the apartheid that sustained what Palestinians are going through today, right? It sustained not even on just an ideological sense, that dark people and white people, and people of a lighter hue ought to not commingle, or whatever other archaic term there was, but it was sustained in a very real economic sense, to the point where the entire economy of the Israeli government was sustained and saved. And that type of technology is still what sustains a large part of the Israeli economy today. But it also goes on to the fact that the rumored atomic bomb the rumored information about the atomic bomb, which was handed to the South African government, was part of the leveraging against our liberation movements in the negotiations to end apartheid, right? So imperialism sustains imperialism. It necessitates itself. It gives itself life, and it births itself around the world. So we must always, always, always we must always fight it wherever we see it, right? So coming from a South African, it's very hard not to be bitter, to not knowing that had the Israeli government not been involved to that extent, we might have gotten a better deal, right? But more so than ever, I think that it makes us very bitter, knowing that the opioid crisis, the drug crisis, the crime crisis, a lot of which are things that are seen by post-war veterans. They were even seen by Vietnam veterans who came home, are things that we are dealing with from our mothers and fathers being shot with Israeli weapons, right? So from a South African, it's very hard not to be bitter. It's very hard not to be angry. But what we must not do is not organize. We can't not organize. We can't be bitter for the rest of our lives. So my gratefulness is that I've been invited here with an international audience who's willing to hear me out and hear and who's shared so many great stories with me, because ultimately the only thing that can help us, the only thing that can get us out of this hellish place that we're in, and truly it is hell, is international solidarity, international standing together, and a complete understanding that the only thing we have to lose is our chains. And with that, I'll bid you adieu.
Thank you so much, Nomkulileko. And thank you so much to all our speakers for taking the time out of your day to speak to us. We know that you folks are very busy people, and some of you are even across the world. So we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak to us. And before I hand it over to Widad for some closing remarks, I would just like to open the floor to any questions to any of our speakers. If you guys want, you can put it in the Q&A box, or you can raise up your hand and you can just speak. I think it was for Josh. Someone said, I don't want to disband the police. Disbanding the police will not get rid of racism.
Hello. So I think to answer that comment, I don't know. I don't think any of this. I feel like I can speak for all the speakers in saying, abolishing police is not the solution to abolishing anti-Black racism completely and totally, but it definitely is an important step. But and I've talked about this elsewhere, when I talk about abolishing police, I'm talking about abolishing policing, surveillance, carcerality, all of it has to go. I'm talking about child welfare. That's why I identify myself as a child welfare abolitionist, as someone who's survived that system. That's why we have euphemisms like Karen, as an understanding that white women, for the ways in which white women particularly deploy their whiteness and their white femininity to terrorize Black people. And so when we're talking about abolishing police, I didn't even say the word disband. I said abolish with my chest, and I continue to do so. We're not talking that we're not saying that there shouldn't be other forms of community safety, but the reality is the most vulnerable people are not experiencing any kind of safety here in this state or across this world. That includes issues like what was identified, such as the opioid crisis, right? Like we are demanding a reinvestment in a different kind of safety that completely reimagines our lives. So, you know, that's the kind of response that I have to people say like this kind of thing where, you know, I don't want to disband the police. You know, I you know, this is not to be shady, but frankly, we're not in a moment of individual asks. When this isn't a moment about individual wants. This is about collective freedom. We're all in chains, whether you're Black, Palestinian, Indigenous, and Indigenous in a broad sense, meaning many communities. So I'm not trying to dismiss individual people, but I'm not dealing with individual asks. I'm dealing with collective demands that say our lives should be free. If that's the conversation you're at, then let's have a conversation. But if you as an individual are struggling with understanding police and policing, and that's not condescending. I, as an organizer, am consistently having to read. I spend most of my day reading something. I'm spending most of my time engaging knowledge, whether that's through Twitter, whether that's through articles, you know, whether that's through conversations. I am actively, you know, someone once told me that they had provided me an invitation into myself to politicize myself. I am actively engaging that invitation. I have never stopped doing the work. And so it is fair for me to say, if you are going to make a claim like I don't want, then you have to take your claim and you have to put it up against the collective history. And if that claim still stands, then by all means. But I can tell you, having read the history, it won't stand. And so that is, and it's important because these kind of comments can also detour us away from possibilities. And I don't have time for detours. I only have time for possibilities of reimagining our Black lives and the conditions of many people and abolishing carcerality, surveillance, and policing. That's what I have time for. And so that's my kind of response to that. And I urge folks, when you show up to these kind of things, when you show up to a space like this, which is you have 3 Black organizers in separate spaces, organizing in different kinds of ways and in collective ways, come with questions, not with statements, because you know, this is also a moment to really humble ourselves a little bit differently and to really engage critically and radically and sit back. Again, citing Patricia Hill Collins, think about where your knowledge claims come from before maybe saying them, because this is how we stay away from detouring away from possible. So that's my response.
Okay, our next question is for anyone, from Logan. She says, what are the key actions you'd like to see people take to take the movement from potential politicalization and shifts to actualize? Oh, and my apologies. I used the wrong pronoun. I'm very sorry, Logan. It's they. My apologies.
I'd add just a few things from my side. One, I would say that there needs to be international organization in order to move it from a potential movement to an actual thing, right? International cross-border organization with common goals, common destination, right? We need to meet, we need to organize, we need to decide what we want. 2, there needs to be a focus on means of production, right? That means identifying land, identifying human beings, identifying all the sources from which our sustenance comes from, right? It's funny enough, it was just this week that there was one Kardashian or the other who was accused of not paying Afghani workers, right? And these things are not isolated situations. A lot of our clothing the capitalist system is sustained by slavery, essentially. Without going into specifics, a lot of our clothing comes from slavery. A lot of our food comes from slavery. so on and so forth. So 2, identifying means of production. 3, going heavy abolitionist, because unfortunately, even the most minute, the most common, the most proper form of slavery, let's say, is still alive, right? Africans are still being enslaved and sold in Libya. People are still being sold for chocolate, right? The chocolate that you eat is made with slavery. Enjoy it tonight. So the coffee that we drink is made with slavery. And even within our prison systems, the things that are produced from prisoners are called slave labor. All of it is a slave production, right? And 4, I think that I just want to hop on to what Josh was saying, because I think it was very profound, right? In terms of where does your knowledge come from and what does it produce, right? Because when did we decide that locking people away took away the problem? I think it's Angela Davis that says that putting people away doesn't change societal ills, it only hides them, right? So putting a prisoner in a cage doesn't stop the fact that people are hungry in these streets, people are addicted in these streets, people are going through the most in these streets. It just puts people away. And so you need to ask yourself, why are those people being put away? And why are those people a very certain shade of brown all the time, right? So those are my contributions. And it's very sad that I didn't say Amandla as a South African, but Aman, power to the people.
I think to go off of what's being said here too, like, you know, in terms of like, I always say the way that I organize is like, I'm shady as fuck. And because I've learned, especially as a Black queer man, I have learned that shade. And if you are someone who understands the what shade means, you have to be witty and quick and knowledgeable in order to be shady. And so through organizing from a politics of shade, I get to create the game board. I find that I'm often dealing with people who are trying to be like, who are engaging in respectability politics, who organize from a very liberal game board. And the problem with that is that means you're organizing from a set of maneuvers that these tyrannical systems have and know what to do. But when I organize from a shady place, I get called bitch, mean, all these kind of other things, but that's all they have because they don't know how to play on this game board. And often I'm able to outmaneuver them because I made the game board. This is my game, right? And so within that, to organize from a politics of shade, or I think some other spaces say organizing from a space of disrespectability, you have to know history, right? When with BLC Ryerson, with the organizers that are there now, because I'm an alumni, I made sure that they understood the history, not only of BLCs, but also of anti-Black racism in that institution, as well as anti-Black racism in this state, as well as anti-Black racism in a global way. So you have to know the history. And this is why I keep saying, read, 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 read. If you are opening your mouth before having picked up a book, you are likely going to get yourself into some trouble. And you know what, or engage, if you haven't engaged community organizers, if you haven't engaged ancestors, if you haven't engaged, elders, if you're not speaking to people who've been doing the work, questionable, who's doing the work, but that's another conversation. If you're not doing these things, you're likely going to be organizing from a game board that these institutions know how to respond to you from. You also have to be creative, right? If you look up some of the artwork that BLC Ryerson's used, people have been like, clutch their pearls, you can't do that. I'm like, but I did, and it's done. What are you gonna do, right? But that also means, and I've said this multiple times, a lot of people always say, Josh, I don't know why people try to fuck with you, because I will defend myself. But that requires knowing how to defend yourself. You need to know the policies of these institutions and these spaces. And yes, you also need to have some way in which you understand the laws, so that way you can protect yourselves in certain kinds of ways. I've been considering writing about something called like the art of Black self-defense, because that's something that needs to be a part of your organizing. And that way you can be creative. And with our shade, we are creative, and often I always say I'm making fun of whiteness. And when you make fun of whiteness, often it just flails, and it blows itself up, and you just sit there and you eat your popcorn and you chuckle, right? And I think this plays into, for folks who've read the book Pleasure Activism, I think that plays into it. Yeah, being shady when I'm organizing is pleasurable. And when I'm organizing with people that I trust, and we have the ethics, and we support one another, and we organize from this space, it is a pleasurable process, even if it is tiring, even if it's exhausting, even if sometimes there's conflict. All of that forms a part of the organizing style. I'm speaking very broad ways as to how you move from possibilities to actualizing, but this is what's worked for me. Right, I like in organizing sometimes with USOR and organizing other spaces. When we've organized, we have actualized, because the style in which we organize with is in such a way that these institutions are forced to respond in the way that we want it to. And the last part is creating lineages and linkages. And this is what I've taught, again, BLC Ryerson. And I think this kind of goes to a question about solidarity globally, is you're making linkages with certain groups and certain individuals and certain people across space, place, and I would argue time, right? That is why I'm invoking Patricia Hill Collins. That's why I'm you hear us invoking folks like Angela Davis. You hear us invoking Dion Brand. You hear us invoking the Black Action Defense Committee, because this pulls this history to the present moment. It makes these linkages and these lineages. It says we are in solidarity with this historical collective demand for our freedom and liberation. And so when you make these partnerships, they have to be critical. I'm not working with just everyone. There are some groups who have not been about Black life, and they're only about Black life in this Black Lives Matter moment, right? And so for those individuals, we reckon. We say, okay, you want solidarity? Let's have a conversation. And it's having these critical conversations, like you said, from an ethical, radical, and transformative justice space. I don't believe that anyone's I don't believe people are disposable, but I do believe that people deserve accountability. I do believe that we need to distance ourselves from and divest from white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and dismantle it. And so from there, you make certain kinds of decisions how you organize. All of that for me is how I organize. It is why, certain individuals stand up for me, and then certain people I can tell they speak at a mic, but who they are when that mic drops is not. There's a cognitive dissonance in how they move, right? And all of that becomes apparent. So yeah, be creative, be disrespectful, be shady, know your history, and create critical partnerships, create lineages, right? A movement should not go with one person. BLC Ryerson continues on, BLC U of T continues on, because we ensure that there would be, and like for everyone else, but I'm like I know, like we ensure there would be a lineage. We did the most we could to ensure there's a lineage. We continue to create lineages across universities, right? People think that I'm a student at Laurentian, Ryerson, and University of Windsor all at the same time. No, I'm just present and going in and supporting people when they ask, and it's doing that kind of work. So also be very cautious of groups that seem to kettle information, that seem to kettle skills, that don't seem to do the public politicized education. There seems to be no kind of way of engaging them for politicized thought. And if you go with them with critical questions, they shut you down and push you out. Be very cautious of those spaces, because that will tell you about their ethics, and that will tell you that they're not actually Black and radical, even if they shout Black Lives Matter. So yeah, that's what I'm going to say on that. I see that there's lots of questions now, so I'm good for that.
Okay, so I think we're going to go another 10 minutes for questions, if that's okay with the speakers. So the next question, I'm just going to go in order of like who sent them. So the next question would be, what is the envisioned alternative to dismantling capitalist hierarchical structures? Will communism or socialist instruments be used in the interim, and how will that redistribute the inequalities?
Especially, again, we're in a moment of reckoning. We're using a language, and particularly here in Canada, Dr. Ronaldo Walcott says it is difficult to have the grammar for Black life in Canada, particularly because the Black diasporic nature as to what happens here and the way that we're always so erased. And so it's like, this is why I keep saying go read, because again, Dion Brand, for example, the way that she creates a grammar for our lives here and elsewhere, helps you think about how, like, I almost say, think about how you want to feel though, right? Like, and if you think from an embodied space, when we think, at least for myself, I don't feel safe around cops, nor do I feel like whatever issue I'm going to have is going to be substantively taken up by this institution or body. So why am I going to engage this system knowing that that's my feeling? Instead, it's about creating certain kinds of like, and I know Angela Davis said this recently when she was in conversation with the Dream, I forget what they're called, it's like the Dream Collective or something, but like she was saying, you know, as we deconstruct, we also need to reconstruct new institutions. And like you said, there are people who have been living their lives without police. Like, it's actually not that mind-boggling. And I think in terms of, you know, alternatives to, like, while we dismantle capitalism, you know, we're not saying that people, for example, that there shouldn't be, I guess, in a broad way, compensation. Like, if you do work, you should be working and living well, right? Of course. But like, we should be doing work through the work that we want to do. I don't want to be a lawyer. I hate the field. It's trash. It's a waste of my time. And frankly, I'm spending most of my time hearing a lot of people who haven't picked up a book and read history tell me how they think life should be organized and how we should organize our lives, right? It's a waste of my time. I'm a very undisciplined person. Dr. Ronaldo Walcott recently just said, for universities, we're not trying to say that these disciplines should change themselves. We're actually saying there shouldn't be disciplines, right? I am someone who loves music and art, but through the conditions of life, I've had to be an organizer. I've had to go off to law school. This is not how I want to structure my life. I do not feel good in these disciplines. And it's really starting to, like Yusra said, uproot these capitalist ideas. Like, why can't I have gone to school and learned healing and social work practices while engaging music and being supported in that, and that be free, right? And also, you know, why can't we decommodify? Like, frankly, the pandemic has been impactful in many ways, but yeah, I was someone that, like, things shut down and I got to shut down for once and recover from the burnout that I'm experiencing. So why can't we decommodify and be supported through that? Why am I having to pay rent that is astronomical? And we have Doug Ford, for those who know him, we have Doug Ford making it even more difficult to be a quote unquote tenant. So it's just these kinds of things that we're saying all this can be uprooted. And if these ideas and these feelings fall under a certain banner, such as communism and socialism, then by all means, right? Like, you know, I will admit that I'm not well read in, like, what is socialism, what is communism, beyond hearing what other folks say about it. I'm like, oh, that sounds good to me. I think I'd feel good under that, like that regime, right? So it's, again, reading and understanding that for years there have been alternatives placed. And of course, we reckon with the alternatives. Social work is a policing profession. It's a disastrous policing profession created by white women who couldn't wear a badge to be cops, and so they wore a name tag instead, right? So we're reckoning with all of it. And slowly, I think we are coming to terms with the fact that we can have alternatives. So that would be what I would say in terms of that. So the question of how do we speak on anti-Zionism and differentiating from anti-Semitism when that tactic is used, I mean, the other folks can jump in. I'm just gonna say this quickly. Don't get lost in the semantics of whiteness, because once you do, you are distracted and you are detoured, right? And so that's why I said you outthink it. And more so, what I would say is, if you find someone saying, well, that's anti-Semitic, you say, listen, the tactics that you're trying to do is you're trying to distract us away from, like, talking about Zionism and the impact and the occupation of Palestine. And the violence over there, and you're using a rhetorical device to move us away from reckoning with what's happening. So we're not going to do that, and you shut it down. Frankly, kind of like I shut down the comment that I was saying I don't want to disband the police, right? Because, you know, I'm not going to get lost in those kinds of semantics. They're the semantics of whiteness, and you don't have to spend your time doing that. You don't have to spend your time responding to whiteness, but you do have to know how to outthink it. So that's what I'm just going to say to that question.
It would be from Rada. She says, thank you for the illuminating and powerful words. Can you please give some insight into the kind of organizing South African solidarity activists do for Palestine?
Thank you for the question. So in South Africa, there's actually a very, very um, integrated BDS movement, integrated with the state, that is, because during the apartheid struggle, one of the most faithful allies to the current government, the African National Congress, was the Palestinian people, as led by and the PLO, as led by Yasser Arafat. Wow, I almost forgot that. Yes, as led by Yasser Arafat. So the continuation with the Palestinian people was one that was somewhat natural. So within the state, there's a very strong lobby for the Palestinian peoples. But within the universities, we also have International Apartheid Week with if I'm not mistaken, it is with the international community. I'll check my facts on that. Some of our universities have even gone on to have have an academic boycott of the state of Israel, such as the Tshwane University of Technology. And that's essentially what a lot of the IAWE events are around in the different universities, pushing for a complete boycott. And then there's your movements in different communities, such as your Palestinian Solidarity Alliance, and so on and so forth, who often bring Palestinians to the country to essentially share their stories, raise awareness, because unfortunately the Palestinian struggle is something that doesn't get enough airtime a lot of the time. So I remember a few years ago, Ahed Tamimi had been brought, and her sister, if I'm not mistaken, I forgot. Yes, but there's a lot of Palestinian activists which have come to the country and seen us and spoken to us. And we also then organize for their help, for their aid. This kufia that I'm wearing right now was made in Palestine. So we do that in terms of raising funds. We've also raised funds for the surgeries of activists and children who were shot by the Israeli government. So it's it's a very broad type of activism. I don't know if there's anything we aren't doing essentially. I just think that there needs to be a pressing more in terms of what we need to be emphasizing on. What we are currently emphasizing on is a complete discommunication with the Israeli state. We've only succeeded in having the embassy downgraded to a liaison office, but even that's not good enough. So yeah, the activism in South Africa is quite broad, but the broadness of it is definitely very much owed to the history that South Africa shares with Palestine. I'm sorry, I am going to just abuse you for a second, because I see another question from Khada about responding to the argument that Palestinian return is not possible due to the impossibility of peaceful coexistence with Israelis. I'm going to keep this very short. The Palestinians have never been given the opportunity to peacefully exist with the Israelis. Israel fell upon Palestine. Israel was never negotiated. Israel was never spoken to with the people. So it doesn't make sense to say that Palestinians are the ones who can't peacefully coexist with the Israelis when the Israelis are the ones who bulldozed into their country and have been taking more and more and more since 1948 until now, and even going into surrounding countries such as your Syria and so on and so forth. So people who say that Palestinians cannot peacefully coexist with Israelis need to begin at the point where the Israelis meet Palestinians in the first place. No one has ever seen a Palestinian react to a Israeli under peaceful conditions because it has always been under war. So that's the essential, that's the only response. Palestinians have never known a peaceful existence with the Israeli people. and therefore Palestinians can never be judged about how can they can exist with Israeli people. Can Israeli people exist with Palestinians? That's the only history we can judge, because that's the only history we've seen. And so far, it seems as if the problem lies there. So yes, I don't think Palestinians have been given the opportunity. Therefore, they ought to not be given the burden to prove themselves. The proof lies with the people who are pointing guns at a city, who are pointing bombs into a city, who are shelling hospitals and schools, who are essentially demolishing people's entire lives in a few days' time. Those are the people who need to prove themselves, not the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you so much for responding to all the questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to go through all of them, but thank you all for coming, and I'm going to pass it over now to Widad to make some final remarks.
I'd just like to thank all our speakers. You folks made such amazing talks, so informative and such powerful speeches. And I'd like to thank you all, and PSC is so grateful to have you join us for this event. And I'd also like to thank our attendees for attending this event, and I'd like again to encourage you all to follow PSC York on our social media platforms if you'd like to be informed of our events and our work. So yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and wish you all a wonderful day.